FlutterFlow recently released a new widget that will greatly help you build amazing and flexible layouts. And so in today's video, I'm going to be explaining to you what this new layout widget is, how to use it, and also I'm going to be giving you a general overview and tutorial of FlutterFlow layouts, so that way you can build the very best app possible for your specific users, regardless of what kind of device they're using. Now, before we get started, as always, all the apps that I discuss on this channel can be viewed and or cloned by joining our amazing Patreon community. And if you're still not a member, then you can learn more and join via the first link in the description below the video. Now, one of the new widgets that FlutterFlow has made available is called Flex. And this widget can be used as an alternative to row and column. It allows you to dynamically set the layout axis based on specific conditions or logic, okay? And so this is a very, very cool widget that will allow you to build all kinds of awesome layouts depending on your specific use case. But before I talk about this widget, I think it's going to be a good idea to talk about FlutterFlow layouts in general. So that way you have an arsenal of different things that you can use to build the very best app possible for your specific use cases. And so I went ahead and I built out this sample app here that showcases the various layouts that are available when you're using FlutterFlow. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to run this app so that you can have a better idea of how it works. So the first layout I want to show you is a very, very simple layout, and that is the row layout. So what exactly is the row layout? Well, the row layout allows you to position the children inside this row in a horizontal fashion. Okay, so as you can see, I have here a list of various European capitals, and they are positioned horizontally. Now, there's one important thing that you need to know when it comes to rows and also columns, is that they're not constrained. And so you can put as many as you want here. Rows don't care, they're not going to limit, but your app is going to care, right? Your app is going to limit. And so if we go back here, you can see that I have a row here that's being fed from an app state, right? So I have here an app state, and I have here a list of various cities, okay? And so if you go back here, what's going to happen here is that it's not going to constrain it, right? So with row, you have to take special precaution, okay? And that applies to columns as well. And so there's various things that you can do. You can put a container around the row. You can limit it. You can also, on each of the children, you can set expansions, right? So, you know, for this one child that we have here, which is generated from a list, I can set an expansion. And what's that going to do is that's going to give it exactly the amount of space it needs so that all of them can fit in the row without any overflow. Okay, so if I go over here and I rebuild my app, we shouldn't have any overflow issues anymore. And as you can see, now we don't have any overflow issues because it's trying its best to position them so that all of them fit together. Okay, and obviously this is probably not what you want 99% of the time. And so if you want to list these items, a row is probably not the best approach because you have lots of items and it's going to be hard to kind of position them so that there's no overflow. Okay, so we'll talk about some of the other layouts that are going to be better in this case. Okay, now the second layout that I want to talk about is the columns layout. Okay, it works exactly the same, except now it positions the items one on top of the other, or you know, the subsequent at the bottom of the previous. Okay, so we have this one, we have this one, we have this one, and they're not going to be, you know, horizontally, right? They're not going to be next to each other. They're going to be one below the other. Okay, exactly the same thing. And we still have the same issue. Okay, so if we were to list more cities, we would have an overflow, right? Because columns do not care about constraining the children, right? Constraints are very, very important. I have a video on constraints that you absolutely need to know. You're going to see that video right there. But essentially, you know, your widgets, some can't constrain, some don't want to constrain, some must constrain, and some, they let other widgets decide, right? Columns and rows do not care about constraints. And so as a result, if we had more, you would have an overflow. Okay. So that is another thing. Okay. The next one I want to talk about is this flex widget that was just introduced. Okay. So what is the flex widget? Okay. So the best way to understand and kind of master this flex widget is it's a column and a row at the same time. And so dynamically you decide whether it's going to be a column and a row. Okay, so unlike these previous ones where this is going to be a row no matter what, and this is going to be a column no matter what, with a flex widget, you decide. Okay, so right here, we start off with a column, but if I click here, guess what? We're toggling it into a row. I toggle this again, it becomes a column. So I decide at runtime. Okay, I can say initially you are a column or initially you are a row, but I reserve the right to change that at runtime. Okay. So let me show you a really nice use case for this. Obviously, you're not going to be doing this in your production apps. You're going to be doing something like this. So here what we have is we have a flex widget that behaves according to the screen width, right? So with this narrow kind of mobile view, you see it assumes the layout of a column. But if I increase the view, it becomes a row. Okay, so this is a really, really nice use case for this. And this is one of the best use cases. And in fact, this is what FlutterFlow was talking about here. This is especially useful for creative responsive layouts where child elements should be horizontal when the screen is wide and vertical when the screen is narrow. And this is exactly what we're doing here. Okay, so if I go really wide, guess what? It stays as a row because it has room, right? It has room to go. But if we go this way, it becomes a column. So how exactly do we do it? Well, let's go back here. This is the one here. And we have here a flex, right? That's being fed with this app state. And with flex, you have this flex property here, right? So we have this is horizontal. Okay, so if this is true, it's always going to be horizontal, right? But we don't want it to be always horizontal. We only want it to be horizontal when it's a wide screen, right? Think about it, right? We only want it to be horizontal when there's enough room for it to expand and to be horizontal, for all the items to be visible, or at least most of the items to be visible. And so what I have here is a condition. I'm basically saying that I only want it to be horizontal when the screen width is greater than breakpoint small. So what is breakpoint small? Well, first of all, screen width is a global property, right? So if you click over here and you go into global properties, you have your screen width. You also have screen height, you have a bunch of other things, but we are specifically interested in screen width. And what is our condition, right? What is the second value? The second value is breakpoint small. Breakpoint small is that point when you move from a mobile device to a tablet, right? It's a predefined constant, okay? So if we go over here and you scroll down to constants, you're going to see breakpoint small, medium, and large. So medium is like a tablet, right? So that goes from, small to medium goes from a mobile device to a tablet. Medium to large goes to like a web app or a desktop app. So these are really good kind of reference points that you can use. And so what I'm doing here is I'm saying, yeah, I'm cool with horizontal only if the screen width is greater than breakpoint small. So if it's not a mobile device, it's a horizontal maybe layout or like a tablet or something like that, then make it horizontal. Otherwise, it's going to be vertical. And that is exactly what we have here. Okay, so that is exactly what's happening. Okay, so flex is basically I can be column, I can be a row. You tell me, and that's why it's dynamic, right? And that's why it's a very, very awesome widget. And in fact, when it comes to Flutter, which is what FlutterFlow is kind of built on, columns and rows, they come from Flex. Flex is like the base widget, right? And that doesn't mean that you're going to be using Flex all the time. I mean, you're going to have situations where you just want columns or you just want rows, right? And you don't care what happens, when they use it. You just want that layout, right? You don't care, like, you don't want it to be dynamic, right? You want it to be rows, you want it to be columns, and you want it to specify in your app. And that's why you're going to be using, rows and columns, but there are lots and lots of situations where you want it to be dynamic, right? Just like how I showed you here, where depending on the screen width, you may want this to be a column, right? Going vertical, or you may want it to be a row if it's longer, going horizontally, right? So that is why Flex is a very powerful widget, and you definitely need to know about it, okay? Next, let's talk about a list view. Okay, so what is a list view? Well, a list view is exactly what it says. It's a view that's derived from a list. Okay, and so if we go back here, we have this list view here, and we have a list view here. And I just have cards, I have text, and I'm saying I have a list of things, and I want to display that list. Now I can display it horizontally, I can display it, I can display it vertically, I can display it horizontally. Okay. Now, with a list view, you can specify vertical here, or you can specify horizontal. Okay. Now, with a list view, there's a couple of things that you need to understand. So if I select this list view, it's always a good idea to give it an expansion. Remember, an expansion is a constraint. Okay. A list view needs to have a constraint, because if it doesn't have a constraint, then you start to get into kind of issues. So anytime you have an option, anytime it's possible, give it an expansion. Just say, hey, take as much space as you need, provided that it doesn't overflow. And when you do this, you can toggle off the shrink wrap, because the shrink wrap is something that you need to do when you're not giving it an expansion. So right now I can't turn it off, right? So it's telling me the list view would have undefined or infinite height, but its parent gives it an unlimited amount of vertical space. And so when possible, you want to give it an expansion, and that way you can remove the shrink wrap, because the shrink wrap, it becomes a hit on performance. Okay, so it's always a good idea to give it an expansion. Okay, let's talk about this other list view, which is horizontal. Okay, so here we have a list view here, and in this case, it's horizontal. So now it's going to be listing as a row. Okay, and so it's exactly the same approach, except it's horizontal. Now here I have a container where I'm limiting the height, right? Because if I don't limit the height, we're going to have an issue, right? Because now it has an unlimited height, and we can't have that. So that is why I have a container here that limits it, right? I can also, change the height. I can make it something like this. And so remember, with list views, they have an unbound height, right? So you want to make sure that you limit that height somehow, okay? Very, very important. Next, we are getting into some interesting widgets here. So here we have a wrap. And what exactly is a wrap? Well, if we run our app here, okay, and by the way, this is a list view here, this is the other list view, right? We can scroll the items, and now here's a wrap. Now, before we discuss the wrap, let me give you kind of a quick tip that's going to help you kind of understand it, right? With layouts, you have either, strongly constrained layouts or weakly constrained, right? So like a flex, it's kind of a weakly constrained, right? Because we can decide how we want it to be, right? A row, well, it's set in stone, but it's also kind of, it doesn't care about, it doesn't constrain its elements. That's why we have to do it. Otherwise, there's going to be an overflow. So you always need to be thinking about constraints, okay? And so when it comes to something like a wrap is something that I would consider weakly constrained, right? Why is that? Well, because a wrap is going to make sure that there's not going to be an overflow by rearranging the items. So depending on your layout, you may have a completely different layout, right? So a wrap is kind of like, listen, I'll take care of it. I'm going to ensure that there's no overflow, but it's going to look different, right? So that is what you need to understand, right? You're not going to get an overflow, but you may not get exactly what you're looking for, right? So what I mean by that is, take a look at this. It's trying to fit these, but it can't get London in there, because if you put London here, it's going to be an overflow on this row. So wrap understands that. It calculates each row so that there's no overflow, and that's why it creates something like this. So this is something that I would call a weakly constraint. Why weakly constraint? Because it doesn't give you exactly what you want. It makes sure there's no overflow, but it doesn't give you exactly what you want, right? So if we do something like this, it's a completely different layout. And if I had more, we would have an overflow here. And then if I go here, we would not have an overflow, right? So with the wrap, you're basically telling FlutterFlow, hey, I don't care how it appears, get it to work, but I just don't want to have any overflows, okay? And so if we go back here, we have a wrap here, and very, very simple, we have a wrap, and you can set a direction and all of that, and it's gonna make sure that there's no overflow, okay? So it's kind of like, it works slightly different than like a row, for instance, right? With a row, you're gonna have an overflow. Row doesn't care about, you could put 2, you could put, 200, and if it's too much, you're gonna have an overflow because row is not gonna do the work for you. Whereas wrap is gonna do some of the work for you. Okay. Now the next one that I want to talk about is the grid, and I view the grid as the exact opposite of a wrap. So whereas a wrap will work kind of behind the scenes to make sure there's no overflow, and it's going to kind of arrange things. A grid will always be a grid, right? So if you take a look at this wrap, it's kind of messy, right? It's kind of messy. It's not, you have 4 items, you have 3, you could have had 4, you could have had 6. It doesn't care. Whereas a grid is very strict, right? A grid is always gonna look like a grid no matter what. So if we have 3 here, it's always gonna be 3 here. If we had 4 here, it's always gonna be a grid of 4. Okay? And so with the grid, you're kind of tight. And another thing with the grid is that, so if you take a look at the wrap, you see how it respects the sizing of each item, right? Because this is exactly how I have it sized, right? So if I go to my flex or row, actually, row, you see how it's sized. And a column does not change it, right? We only changed it in a row because we did that expansion. But with a wrap, we have the same thing. It doesn't change it. But with a grid is going to change your children. It's going to size them up so that it looks like a grid, right? So if we go over here and we go to this grid here, and let's say we have this grid view and we say cross-axis count is 3. So we want 3 items, in this case, horizontally. Great, it's going to expand them. It's going to blow them up. It's not going to respect the kind of what we tell it, the constraints that we give it. It's going to expand it because it's going to make it look like a grid. Right? If we do, let's say 4, it's going to do the same thing. It's going to make sure it's a grid of 4, and that's going to size them up so that, you have the size of the right size so that 4 of them appear horizontally. Okay? So if you take a look here, you can see that it sizes them up. It doesn't care if they look good or doesn't. It only cares about the grid. It only cares about that the grid looks good. Okay? So if I put something like 2, now we're going to have a grid of 2 horizontally, right? This cross-axis count, okay? So if we come here, we refresh this, and this is what we see. We see 2 items horizontally because that's the cross-axis, and it sizes them up because it cares about that grid, right? It's always going to be a grid. It's never going to be like, 4 here, 3 here, 3 here. It's not going to be this kind of this messy UI. It's always going to be a grid. And so if you need a grid and you need to make sure it appears as a grid, you need to use a grid, right? If you use a wrap, you're not really sure. You're not guaranteed a certain alignment. You're just guaranteed that there's not going to be any overflow, okay? Very, very important. And last but not least, I want to show you a staggered view, which is a kind of a combination between a grid and a wrap. It's more of a grid, but it's not as strict of a grid, okay? And this is a view that allows you to line up the items so that they fill in the empty spaces. So if you take a look here, we have one item, we have another item, and they're all of different heights. I made them specifically to be so that the next one is has a slightly greater height than the previous one. Okay, so Oslo, Paris, Madrid, Lisbon, you see how they increase. And you see this is not a grid because a grid would never look like this. A grid would be equal, right? So for instance, if you take a look at this grid, you see how they're equal here. They're equal, they're on the same kind of level. Whereas this one doesn't really care, right? It doesn't really care. It's trying to fill in the empty space, right? And this is a staggered view. And so if we come over here, this is our staggered view here. we are feeding it with our cities, and we have a cart, we have a container. And what I'm doing on this container level is I'm basically passing it the index of the item. So the first item is 0, next item is 1. You know, we have 10 items, so it's going to be from 0 to 9. And we're saying take this index, add 1, because we have 0, and multiply by 35. And so that way, the first item is going to be 0 plus 1 multiplied by 35. The first item is going to be a height of 35. But then the second item is going to be slightly more, right? So we have 1 plus 1, 2 times 35, we have 70, etc., etc. So that way the height is increasing, and you have this kind of staggered look, right? And as you can see, it's trying to fill in the space, the empty space, right? So for instance, we have this here, and a grid would make sure that it looks like a grid. Whereas this one, it doesn't really care about making it a grid. It's trying to fill in the empty space, right? So this one is empty. You know, if it was a grid, this would be lower, and then you would have empty space here, right? And so this way, it's trying to kind of give you a grid, but also, you know, to fill out. So this approach is really nice if you need some kind of a collage. You're building like a photo app, like a Pinterest type app, or like a Flickr type app, or what have you. And you want your items to kind of, you know, you don't want a grid. You just want them to be in space, in kind of taking up as much of a space as possible. And this is also great for like a notes app, right? You're building a notes app. You might have one note with like one word. You might have another note with a bunch of with like a sentence, with like or like a paragraph, and you just want them to appear in this kind of fashion. And so a staggered view is going to work best, because you don't want like a grid for that, right? Because you have different items of different heights, different sizes. It's not going to look good, right? A grid is perfect for if the items are the same, right? If you're dealing with exactly the same sized items, like pictures that are the same size. And you definitely don't want to wrap, right? Because, you know, well, I mean, you could kind of try being a wrap, but a wrap is going to be something else. A staggered view for this kind of use case is going to be perfect, because you're going to have a grid that's not as strict as the grid view. Okay, so this is another great layout that you can use in your apps. All right, so these are kind of the major layouts. Obviously, you can mix and match layouts. You can have a list view, you know, here. You can have a grid here. You can have, you know, all of these other kind of, you can get one specific layout widgets inside of another as a child. You can mix and match. You can do all kinds of things. But the point here is to give you options, right? So no matter what kind of app that you're trying to build, you will be able to build it using these available layout systems, these available layout widgets. Okay, anything from very, very simple layouts to very, very complex layouts, you will be able to build it. And now that we have this flex widget, you have even more flexibility. You have even more control over the kind of layouts that you're building. So regardless what kind of app that you're planning to build, for sure you'll be able to build it using a combination of these layout systems or layout widgets. Now, I talked about lots of things happening. I also kind of fed data here from app state, lots of things. And really, it's one thing to kind of view this app like, on a video, like I'm, like you're viewing it right now, but a completely different experience to be able to view this app on your own computer, to be able to clone this app, to be able kind of to play with it, right? Because in my own experience, I have learned the fastest when I practice, right? It's not from reading stuff. It's not from, watching videos. Videos are great, but it's all about practice. And so you want to get access to this app, and you want to see how all of this is done without needing to kind of start from scratch, start from zero, and reinvent the wheel. And you'll be able to do just that, meaning clone this app, view this app, when you join our amazing Patreon community. Because remember, when you become a member, if you're not a member yet of our amazing Patreon community, you're going to get access to all these apps that I talk about on this channel, right? Which means that you can clone them. You can even connect to my own Supabase instance, right? Some of these complex apps that I built, they use a Superbase backend. And so I have those backends. They're available. They're live. I do not destroy them. And you'll be able to connect to them as well, which means you get access to a fully functioning app, sometimes with a backend, sometimes with no backend. But regardless, it's a fully functioning app that you can start learning from, right? Because everything that you see here, everything that I demonstrate to you guys is exactly what you get, right? You don't get anything else. You don't get like a crippled app. You don't get a limited app. You get the exact app that I demonstrate for you guys in this video. And additionally, you're also going to get access to extra content, more specifically my weekly video podcast, where I talk about some of the things that I'm working on, some of the things that I'm planning to work on. It's a way for me to connect with the community and to learn what you guys are struggling with, what kind of content you want to see. It's a way to start a conversation and to help you guys out. And so if you want to get access to all of that, you want to get access to our weekly podcast where I talk about things that I don't really talk about on this YouTube channel. Plus, if you want to support this channel, support my work, support the kind of stuff that I'm doing, especially if it's helpful to you guys, then you definitely need to become a member of our incredible, rapidly growing Patreon community. And of course, you'll also connect with other members of the community, see what they're doing, exchange knowledge, and exchange expertise. And so you can become a member of our amazing Patreon community by clicking the first link in the description below the video. And hopefully I will see you inside.